something that's also crucial for the French government, which holds 15% of Renault.
Vous avez le défi du véhicule autonome.
There is the challenge of autonomous cars and of electric cars. Only companies with massive development funds will be able to meet that challenge.
Pourront faire face à ces défis.
Renault took a stake in Nissan in 1999 when the Japanese car maker was on the brink of bankruptcy. Their alliance allows them to save some 5.5 billion euros per year through their common platforms, purchasing and development. But their partnership is not an equal one. Renault holds 43% of Nissan, which enables it to vote on board decisions, while Nissan holds 15% of Renault. This distribution was decided when Nissan was weaker than Renault, but the Japanese carmaker has turned around the situation, producing more than the French brand, and its leaders want to review the deal.
Now, our business editor Stephen Carroll tackled this topic of Ghosn's departure along with other issues with Bruno Le Maire, that's France's finance minister, in Davos. That interview will be aired here on France 24 at 4:45 p.m. Thank you for watching.
Special event.
Brexit, a rise in populism and slowing economic growth. There's plenty for business and political leaders to discuss in Davos. But with the likes of Donald Trump and Emmanuel Macron staying away, can the World Economic Forum still draw the attention of the global elite? Join me all this week on France 24 to find out.
Watch events unfold on France 24 and France24.com.
Hello, welcome to the France 24 interview. Well, it's been a little over a month since a fragile truce was declared in Yemen's vital port city of Hodeidah. And in that month, you might want to ask whether or not there's any end in sight to what's been called the world's worst humanitarian crisis. Hodeidah, of course, is the city through which about 3/4 of all the vital food and fuel and aid supplies to Yemen's very hard-hit civilian population was channeled. And joining me today, actually, is the executive director of one of the aid organizations that has been active on the ground there, trying to provide relief to those civilians. Véronique Andrieux is executive director of Action Against Hunger. And more importantly, for our purposes today, you are just back from a visit to Yemen. You traveled around northern cities, but for our purposes, aside from Sana'a and Hajjah, you were in Hodeidah, that port city I was just talking about. Just tell us, what is the situation there right now on the ground 1 month after this ceasefire?
So thank you, Douglas, for inviting me here. So the truce started on December 18th. What we saw there is essentially a reduced level of conflict. There's still clashes at night, some even heavy clashes. But still, I mean, we hope that the ceasefire will hold.
When you say heavy clashes, artillery fire, mortar shells, not airstrikes?
Not airstrikes, but artillery and gunshots.
Do civilians, because these are the people you're trying to help, did you get the sense, did you see life on the streets? Are civilians working? Are markets open? Are people walking about?
So since the truce started, some civilians have gone back to the city. Maybe it's worth noting that 2/3 of the population of the whole governorate of Hodeidah were displaced due to the threats, to the conflict. Some of them are starting to come back. Some shops were open, some schools were open as well. There was some kind of, markets were also functioning, some of them, but half of the city is actually completely cut. You would see these huge containers, like the typical Maersk containers, all graffitied with slogans and messages, about the war and the hope for peace for the Yemeni people, for a better future. There was also in the streets a number of big piles of sand and rocks to prevent movement across the city.
That's exactly it. Lots of obstacles, lots of roadblocks.
A lot, and increasingly so, of course, as you get closer to the port, and a number of checkpoints also to get into the city, very, very important, both if you want to go down south or into the north to Hadja, a lot of checkpoints.
So clearly still a very tense situation, uncertain situation. We've talked about this crisis. We've talked about how there are some 20 million hungry people, 3/4 of the population. Some are actually on the brink of famine, children particularly hard hit. You say markets were open. Presumably there's food. Can anyone afford the food? Are people eating? Are they able to get nutritious food?
Okay. I want to know that this, the situation, Yemen is the poorest country in the Middle East and was already the poorest country in the Middle East before this conflict. The levels of poverty were alarming, including malnutrition levels before the conflict. However, the conflict has deeply aggravated the situation, and the percentage of people falling through the cracks in terms of food security is increasing. So if we take, for instance, the IPC, so the integrated food security phase classification, we see that there is
that's
at
a
least
5-point classification.
Exactly.
I understand.
Absolutely. If you take IPC 4, that's the emergency threshold. If you take IPC 5, it's catastrophe.
Right. Okay. And I think 250,000 people are in the worst, the most severe catastrophic category.
You're right. That's IPC 5. Indeed. Yes, it's 1% of the population of Yemen in that situation across about 100 districts out of the 330 districts in Yemen.
How do you get food to these? How had you been getting food to people, and how is it easier right now to get food to them? And are you actually able to do so? Are you able to do your job?
Well, there's, two important elements maybe to flag here. First of all is the economic situation in Yemen that needs to be part of the solution, beyond, of course, a negotiated political peace agreement. But the root causes are very important, and the economic component of the solution is also very, very important. To give you some elements, for 2.5 years, civil servants have not been paid. This means they get no salaries. Right now, the humanitarian community is playing a role of a safety net, paying some incentives to health workers, for instance. The second element is that there is a collapse of the Yemen rial, the Yemeni currency. Which means that taking into consideration that 90% of the food that is in Yemen, that is food imports are 90% in Yemen. This means that the basic food basket is extremely expensive. The cost has tripled since the beginning of the conflict. This is also compounded by the blockade, which means, for instance, if you take Hodeida port, that's 75% of the imports in Yemen, both for fuel, food, humanitarian supplies. 3 out of the 5 cranes there have been brought down and are laying down on the port. Only 2 are standing.
So the infrastructure has been
severely
really
damaged completely, and there is also let's say Saudi controls also on the waters, and screening whatever comes through the port. So in terms of let's say the access to food, it's really complex.
Very complex. I just want to jump in because you were mentioning some of that infrastructure. Hospitals were hit during the war. Saudi-led airstrikes hit hospitals, schools, even wedding parties. Are there functioning hospitals? Where do people go if they're sick? Are there any health services right now available to the population?
Our estimates is that 50% of life-saving basic social services infrastructure are disrupted and not functioning any longer. And those that are still in place can only provide very basic services.
Very basic services.
Very basic.
Clean water, access to clean water, absolutely vital. Millions did not have access to clean water. Cholera was a waterborne disease, and we talked a lot about that. Are there still threats of cholera outbreaks? Has that been solved, or is it being addressed?
So there's been a few waves of cholera. The cholera has been is right now under control. We have to bear in mind that you were mentioning almost 10 million people in severe food security situation.